Okay, good morning. Welcome. Wow, this is my first time to have a conference in a big auditorium like this and on stage. Well, don't worry about the sittings. Actually, we welcome students to occupy the whole auditorium, but somehow they go over to other places to occupy. Morning. Welcome, and once again, Mr. Pema, and our honorable guests and participants and colleagues. It is our great pleasure and honor to have this symposium on Mr. Pema Tseden at our university. Although it was not his first time to come to our university. About 3 years ago, I believe, he had come to our university to give us a talk about his movie. Dr. Jessica Yang and I have thought about organizing this symposium for some time. And the precious opportunity only came along very recently. And thanks again to Jessica, tremendous energies, determination, and driving force, we can at last make it happen. Mr. Pema Tseden is one of the very few Tibetan filmmakers and writers who have been internationally recognized. His feature film, The Silent Holy Stone, is the first Tibetan-made and Tibetan language film in Chinese history. Before it, all Chinese films about Tibet were in Chinese language and mainly made by Han Chinese. Not only Pema's movies, but also his short stories and literary translation are expressive moments of self-representation of contemporary Tibetan lives. His use of varying media in the context of international reception has allowed his works to develop unique intermedial and intercultural dimensions. I would like to thank the support of our department. Without the consent and endorsement of our bosses, the heads of our 2 units, translation program and the Department of Humanities and Creative Writing, we could not make all these events happen. So let me invite Dr. Robert Neven, the director of the Center for Translation and the head of translation program, to give us a welcoming speech. Dr. Neven?
Right, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. This is a very nice, intimate arrangement that we have here, so I hope we're going to have a lot of very intimate discussion on this very interesting theme of transgressing Tibet. Professor Lo has already actually said quite a lot of what I wanted to say, so I'm going to keep it fairly brief, but first of all, on behalf of the Center for Translation and indeed the translation program, I'd like to welcome all of you here today. I'm really delighted that we can organize this event. I think it's going to be a very exciting day, and indeed tomorrow we also have a couple of very interesting events in the morning and the evening as well, so hope that you will also be able to come to those. I say it's exciting and very unusual, particularly for the Hong Kong context, because we don't often get to discuss issues of Tibet in Hong Kong. There obviously are some scholars working on Tibet here, but very few to my knowledge. And I think it's particularly unusual because what we have today is a symposium that combines 3 different strands in relation to Tibet: film, fiction, and translation. Each of those is going to be covered by the different panels that we have on today's program. So we have a total of 3 different panels. And as I mentioned, the title Transgressing Tibet is a very interesting one. I'm not going to explain what that means. I think we're going to have plenty of chance to hear about that. But if you think about the Chinese, the 越界, Xizang is going across borders. It's that sense of transgression, in the sense of breaking down traditional distinctions, going across borders. And I think it's a sort of metaphor, if you like, for what we are going to be doing today, engaging in this kind of cross-cultural dialogue. The person whose work we are focusing on, who brings these strands all together, as is clear from what Professor Lo has just said, is of course Pema Tseden, who I think needs no introduction, having just been introduced. But we are really delighted and honored that he can be with us here today at this symposium and to take part in the discussion. So to discuss these various issues, we have a range of speakers, both local and international, and they will have longer introductions at each of the panels, but let me just mention them very briefly by name in order of the program. So for session 1, that'll be the rest of this morning, Professor Chris Berry from the Department of Film Studies in King's College London. Mr. Ying, film director and part-time lecturer of the School of Film and TV at the Hong Kong Academy of Performing Arts. Then in the second session, we have 3 speakers. The first will be Professor Lo, and then Professor Izumi Hoshi from the Research Institute for Languages and Cultures of Asia and Africa at Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. Dr. Vanessa Franville from the School of Languages and Cultures at Victoria University of Wellington. And then in the final session, which will be moving on towards matters of translation, we have Mr. Longren Chen, a writer from Qinghai and also a prominent translator between Chinese and Tibetan. Professor Patricia Schiaffini from the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures at Southwestern University. And finally, our very own Dr. Jessica Young, who has been mentioned here already, and who I'm also going to heap profuse thanks on in a moment. We're also very pleased to be having a number of moderators. Professor Robert Barnett from the Modern Studies, Tibet Studies program at Columbia University. And just to give a little plug, he will also be speaking tomorrow morning. So welcome. Dr. Roberta Rain, Assistant Professor in the Department of Translation at Lingnan University, who has been working on the history of Tibetan translation. And just to make sure I haven't missed anyone, Dr. Wang Guokgui from our own Department of Humanities and Creative Writing. Dr. Lo Wai-luk, Associate Professor from the Academy of Film at Hong Kong Baptist University. Dr. Mayalen Marin Lacarta, our new Research Assistant Professor in the Translation Program. And Dr. Yao Ping, also from our Translation Program. That is, I think, all the introduction of the long list of speakers, but anyway, at least you are now aware who they are. I'd like to offer my thanks again, similar thanks as Professor Lo has given, to both the organizers of this, the Department of Humanities and Creative Writing, and also to the translation program in the Center for Translation, which I'm representing. I'm looking over to Jessica, way back there. I'd like to thank her particularly on behalf of the translation program for all the organization, all the stress that she's put into it, which is all definitely going to be worthwhile. So once again, thank you to everyone, and may I wish the symposium the very best of success. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Now may I invite Professor Ernie, the Chair Professor of Humanities and the Head of Department of Humanities and Creative Writing, to give us a welcoming speech.
Right. Okay, I'll keep my remarks short because this is such an exciting program that I wouldn't want to deprive you of your time to start the discussion. My first thing is to, of course, thank Casey and Jessica. I don't see, is Jessica around? She's in the back. Right, you should stand up, let everybody see who you are, Jessica. From the translation, okay, she's hiding. So that's another way to recognize her, absolutely. For all your hard work to bring Pema Tseden and the other interlocutors from so many different countries to put together this very exciting program around the idea of transgressing Tibet. This cannot be more timely, I thought, for us to be centering our thoughts, at least for a little while, on Tibet. You know, excuse us, many of us who work and live in Hong Kong, for being so Hong Kong-centric these days on everything that we do and we say. So, you know, for all of us who teach and you know, hold events these days, it's really hard for us to do things as we normally do anymore, at least for many of my colleagues in my department. So again, on behalf of the translation program and the Humanities and Creative Writing Department, we're very pleased to welcome, of course, Mr. Pema Tseden and all the other guests and speakers. So I wish you a wonderful, wonderful time of reflection and discussion. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, John. Once again, Jessica and I would like to thank again, all our honorable presenters, respondents, and participants of the symposium, and colleagues. And we look forward to having a very fruitful and illuminating discussions for today. And we would also like to thank the Hong Kong Asian Film Festival for screening Mr. Pema Tseden's movies to allow the local audience to have a chance to know more about his wonderful works. And we also want to thank our working partners for Unique Peace, Ying Liang, and Jifa, as well as many others who are working very hard behind the scenes, like Phoebe. Where are you? Phoebe Chuk? Is outside? Oh, always behind. We are really working behind the scene, right? And Sapula and many, many others that I cannot name all of them here. Thanks very much. Thanks for their hard work we can make all these events happen. So I'm not talking not just one symposium for the whole series. We still have many other activities going on for the next 2 days. So tomorrow we also have 2 other seminars in the morning. One is presented by Mr. Long Wenqing from Qinghai on the translation cultures between Chinese and Tibetan in Amdo. And the other seminar is by Professor Robert Barnett from Columbia University. The title of his talk is The Cultural Turn, Party Policies in Tibet. We very much will look forward to these very exciting and interesting talks. And in the evening, for tomorrow, in Asia Society at Admiralty, so we can also take the opportunity to visit Admiralty again. We will have the dialogue between Mr. Pema Tseden and another famous filmmaker, Mr. Evan Chan, who is originally from Hong Kong and now mainly working in New York. And also on Saturday, and the Saturday afternoon, well, there would also be a kind of a seminar on Tibetan film and culture, well, by Mr. Pema, which would be held at Broadway Cinematheque. So if you are all interested, well, in joining all these programs, so you're very much encouraged and welcome to do so. Before we start our first sessions, well, may I invite all the presenters, respondents, and colleagues, well, to come forward to take a photo together. Please come forward. Where should we stand over here, or please come over here? Well, just let's take a kind of photo. And of course, well, Wai-luk Lo, we need you at the center of our photo. Wai-luk Lo, 请.
So good morning. I'm the moderator of this morning session. I'm Wong Kok Kui of the Humanities and Creative Writing Department. So our first speaker is Professor Chris Berry. Professor Berry is the Professor of Film Studies at King College London. And he has published many books, including Cinema and the National, China on Screen, Public Sphere Space, Media Space, the new Chinese documentary film movement from the public, for the public record, and electronic elsewhere, media, technology, and social space. The topic of his talk this morning is the road movies in Pema Tseden and Zhang Lu, Space and Identity Beyond the Minority Nationality Film. So, please, Professor Berry.
Is this working now? Can you hear me? Okay, yeah, is that better? Okay. So for the third time, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to be here. I'm delighted to be in Hong Kong, as always, especially at this very special time. And I have to say initially that I'm not by any means an expert on Tibet, and I don't speak Tibetan. And I've never been to Tibet, but I am very interested in Pema Tseden's films, especially within the context of the People's Republic. And it's especially, even though I've never been to Tibet, it's very interesting, of course, to be in Hong Kong at this moment. You know, staying in this area where there's a military base right across the road, with the slogan, you know, follow the party's directions, Ting Dang Zhe Hui, as we look in on one side, and on the other side, 自己香港自己选, and other slogans like that. So maybe, although I've not been to Tibet, perhaps it gives me some flavor of what it might be like to be there. So, okay, this is up there. Now, I should apologize. I've just been through my slideshow, and I can see that in the process of it going over onto this computer, it hasn't made it over totally, but hopefully most of it will be legible to you, and I will do my best to follow it through. This is a presentation based on a larger paper in which I look at two different directors, Pema Tseden and Zhang Lu, and look at them in relation to the idea of the so-called minority nationality film in China. And my argument, of course, is that although they are minority nationality filmmakers, they're not making the old kind of minority nationality films. Let's see, okay. And you, I'm sure you already all know this, and a little bit about Pema and his background, and the part of China that he comes from, or Tibet, and his background, his training at the Beijing Film Academy, and that also he is a famous author as well as a filmmaker. And I think very importantly, somebody who writes in Chinese and in Tibetan and translates back and forth. And it is this kind of trans element that has been very interesting to me and some of my colleagues. The other filmmaker whose work I've been looking at is Zhang Lu. And Zhang Lu is Korean Chinese, born in the area of China just north of the border with North Korea, known as Yanbian in Chinese, or Yeonbyeon in Korean. And his background is as a professor of Chinese literature at Yanbian University before he began making films. In the overall paper, there are sort of a number of themes that I try to follow through. First of all, I contrast Pema and Zhang's films with the old so-called minority nationalities film genre. And I want to argue, I'll do that in a moment. I mean, my main argument is there's a shift from making films under the process of serving the government policy to one that is more directed towards self-identity and production of local cultural consciousness. But then I also want to look at their films in particular in relation to what are generally known as road movies. And I would argue that in relation to the main scholarship on road movies, both Pema and Zhang's films can be seen as part of a process of de-Americanizing the road movie. The road movie used to be thought of as the quintessential American genre, but I think people more and more are beginning to see there are lots of different kinds of road movies all over the world. And in the third part of the presentation, I then compare Pema and Zhang's films as different kinds of depictions and imaginations of what it means to be Tibetan Chinese and Korean Chinese, and also Korean, actually, in the case of Zhang Lu's films. The argument is that through these road movies, we see in Pema's case the continued appearance of a Tibetan homeland. And then this opens up some questions about how this homeland is imagined. And on the other hand, in Zhang Lu's case, perhaps more radically, there is no homeland left, only a state of endless displacement. No travel offers hope of a return to the homeland in the case of Zhang Lu's films. Of course, because of the theme of today's workshop, I will not spend so much time talking about Zhang Lu's films, only a little bit on his films, and more on Pema's films. So I'm sure many people here are already quite familiar with the so-called minority nationality film genre, the 少数民族电影. But just a few words about that to set up a context, a historical context, and a contrast between those films and Pema's films today. The so-called minority nationality films were produced most strongly during the Mao era, when the command economy was operating, including in the film industry, so that plans were produced every year for studios to produce films in certain theme categories. And the so-called minority nationality film was one of these theme categories. I think that it's fair enough to say that they were straightforward propaganda films about the Chinese Communist Party's liberation of various minority nationalities, and they're always based around the model of class struggle in some form or other. So you have here a still from the very famous example of the minority nationality films Serfs from 1963, in which the structure of the narrative is very much about Tibet as before the liberation, as a space where there are rigid feudal class structures, and the Communist Party comes in to liberate the serfs, as is happening here in this particular scene. Now I'm sorry about the way this slide has come out. I don't know why it's come out this way. Today in the market economy, there have been some new changes, and I just want to talk a little bit about that. I think there are the films about ethnic minorities continue in two forms, and I'm deliberately using the term ethnic minority now as opposed to minority nationality to mark that period shift from the Mao era to the market economy era. I think the one group of films are films made primarily for Han Chinese audiences, usually, not always, but usually by Han Chinese directors. And they continue to tell the kind of developmentalist stories of Han Chinese benevolence towards backward peoples who need to be helped with modernization, but they combine them with market-pleasing elements, such as lots of singing and dancing, and also quite a bit of romance. And a film like Red River Valley, which is up here from 1997, would be a very good example of that kind of film. And the second kind of cinema, which is the kind that interests me much more, is films that are made by ethnic minority filmmakers themselves, aimed, and this is the other thing that interests me, they're aimed obviously at their own audiences, at ethnic minority audiences, but also aimed at Chinese audiences and global audiences through film festivals. And I think one of the very interesting features of Pema Tseden's work is its ability to cross, in that trans sense, cross many borders and to be welcomed by different audiences who presumably see the films in different ways. And I'll come back to that a bit more as I talk more about these films. So in a way, in this case, I think in the market economy, there is a lot of emphasis on selfhood, identity, and production of identities. And these films participate in that kind of process of producing self-consciousness and subjectivity. So let me just talk a little bit briefly about Pema and Zhang Lu as two different types of filmmakers working in the second category of films by ethnic minority filmmakers about ethnic minorities. There's one very obvious contrast between them. And the first thing is that all of Pema's filmmaking occurs within the system in the People's Republic. It isn't filmmaking that does not go through the censorship process. And clearly this is necessary because Tibet is considered such a sensitive topic that it's impossible for any filmmaker who's making feature films to operate without cooperating with that process. So all of Pema's films, and this is sometimes surprising to people outside China, all of his films have gone through the process of being approved by the Film Bureau, and in many cases, as is the example of Silent Holy Stones on the slide here, they've won awards in mainland China and won a welcome. I think one reason for this is that although the films show how traditional Tibetan culture is coming under threat or is being damaged in various ways, the question of how to read the source of that damage is very open. There's nothing, for many audiences, I think, in China, it's possible to just, for many audiences in China and also presumably for the Film Bureau, it's possible to read that damage to Tibetan traditional culture as simply the result of the process of modernization. And the idea of modernity as something that challenges and is damaging to traditional culture is a theme we hear also from inside China about the experience of modernization for Han Chinese as well. So maybe that's also important. In contrast, Zhang Lu operates and always has operated and been able to operate completely independently. As far as I know, none of his films have been through the censorship process in the PRC. He also, unlike unlike Pema, who went to the Beijing Film Academy, Zhang Lu has no formal film training at all. I believe that the story in his case is that he was challenged by a friend to make try and make a short film and send it to Venice. And his friend said to him, nobody will ever accept your film in a major film festival. And so he did it and they accepted it. And so then he decided, okay, maybe I should start making some longer films as well. And although they have these differences between their practices, one thing they share in common is that both of them work in the appropriate language for the ethnic minority in question, either using Tibetan language or Korean language. And this contrasts very clearly to the old minority nationality films, all of which were dubbed into Mandarin and all the characters spoke Mandarin. So now onto the sort of second part of the paper, where I look at the road movie. I notice that all of Pema's films, his feature films, can be understood quite readily by audiences as road movies where travel is a very crucial part of the plot. And I think for those of you who've seen his films, it's not difficult to understand that that is a crucial quality. Although I'm not going to talk about it at length today, with Zhang Lu's films, there's a need to justify the argument that they're road films or travel films a little bit more. It's not so obvious that they're road movies. I think that in his case, although they are not necessarily on the road, they're all films about the problem of movement. And this is, retrospectively, it becomes clear that this is true even of his first feature film, Tang Poetry. Tang Poetry was set entirely inside an apartment in Beijing, so there's no travel outside the apartment involved. But of course, when one learns that this is because the film was shot at the time of the SARS crisis in 2003, then it becomes clear that in some sense it's part of the story of the film is the problem of not being able to move, not being able to leave the apartment. And in many of his films, the problem of crossing borders and so on is very important. Now, to talk a bit more about road movies and scholarship on road movies and the idea of the road movie, as you can see, the idea of the road movie itself has been fairly recent. it starts to get recognized in the late 60s and early 70s, and scholarship really only picks up towards the end of the last century. Most of the early scholars writing about road movies talk about it as a quintessentially or typically American genre, and you get quotes like this one on the slide that you can see, where they talk about it as the result of the counterculture of the late 1960s, about the liberation of the road, and so on. So David Lederman, who's quoted here, also says, the road movie appears as a dynamic manifestation of American society's fascination with the road. But even in the early-ish scholarship on road movies, some divisions start to emerge around this. Steve Cohen and Ina Ray Hark, who are the editors of the road movie book, even though they argue for the road movie as this American genre from the 1960s, in their own book, they trace it all the way back to the 1930s. And then David Lederman, who I just quoted, goes back even earlier, invoking Homer's Odyssey, so he goes right back into ancient Greek literature. And more recently, a whole lot of other scholars have looked at this tradition outside the American context. And they end up arguing, as is quoted here on the slide, that maybe we should not so much talk about road movies as talk about travel films, and recognize that the mode of transport might not be the car, it might be the bicycle, it might be on foot, it might be the train, etc., etc. So just jumping through the whole paper, in trying to work through Pema's films and Zhang Lu's films as road movies, I gave myself a set of basic questions, and I asked, where does the travel happen? What's the nature of the travel? Is it free, or are there a lot of obstacles? What's the route that is followed in the travel? What's the mode of transport? Who does the traveling? Why do people travel? What are some of the cinematic qualities? And then what does all of this say about cultural identity? I want to say at this point that one of the things I'm not going to talk about I think I've got about 5 minutes left, is the cinematic qualities so much of the films. But one of the things I'm very interested in both Zhang Lu's films and also Pema's films, both directors use the 180-degree cut. I don't mean the reverse shot, but a complete 180-degree flip. And this is very unusual, and it seems to me very interesting that both filmmakers use this. But they use it in very different ways, and I'm going to explore that later in some other work that I'm going to do. I'm going to start to follow that up in more detail. So very briefly on Zhang Lu, just to sum up, to set a contrast between his films and Pema's films. There's no free travel in boundary-free space in his films. It's completely different in that way from the American road movie. In all his films, people are dealing with boundary problems, being trapped, being unable to get across borders, and so on. Also, it's quite common in his films that it is the secondary characters who travel, and the protagonists, the main characters, who are the ones who are trapped and cannot travel. But even those who are traveling are often doing so not through choice, but because they've been forced to do so. There's no clear point of origin, and there's no clear destination. And in many cases, the protagonists are women and children, which is also an interesting feature of his films. And all of these characteristics, Pema's films are quite different from Zhang Lu's films in this way. In the case of Pema's films, in terms of where does the travel happen, as far as I know, so far all the films have been set in the Amdo region of Pema's birth. There are no serious frontiers or boundaries, really. There is relatively free travel. There's a couple of exceptions to that. First of all, in The Search, the filmmakers who are searching for a lead actor in their film, they're driving in a car, but they repeatedly run into situations where their ability to drive down the road is blocked by herds of goats crossing the road or herds of yaks. And so again, there's this clear contrast between the idea of modernity represented by the car and tradition by the animals. And second exception, in his last film, Old Dog, we see fences that have been set up to mark individually owned or controlled pasture lands. And the idea of encroaching privatization and enclosure of space is communicated especially powerfully in one very celebrated long scene towards the end of the film, where one of the sheep becomes detached from the flock and is trying to get back in through the fence to the other sheep. And eventually it succeeds, but only after a long struggle. But of course, even these two exceptions are not to do with barriers erected by the state. So there's no crossing or dealing with state boundaries in the films. No transborder narratives, and that's quite interesting. What about the routes taken? And I've noticed here that all the travel is through these very grand, beautiful landscapes, and there's, of course, a contrast between the pristine landscapes and the cultural threat and damage represented by modernity in many of the narratives. So just briefly, what is the kind of structure of the narratives? In the Silent Holy Stones, it's a kind of back and forth narrative between the monastery and the hometown, and then back to the monastery again. And in between, the journey is conducted on horseback, with the young monk being taken back and forth by his father. And halfway on the journey, in each case, they go to where the carver of the holy stones, is the Mani stones, lives by himself out on the plateau. And of course, sadly, on the journey back, he's died on the way back. In the case of The Search, it sets out to be a circular journey, going out through various places to find the actor and return, and alternating on the journey between auditions of actors and the businessman in the car telling his love story to the people in the car. But actually, although the actor is found, the director, in the process of going through all this, loses his confidence in his ability to cast somebody in the main role in his film. And so it ends up being an incomplete circle, a circle that does not go back to the beginning. And the third film, Old Dog, oscillates between the town and the farm and the space up in the pasture lands, where there is an old ruin where the farmer, the old man, takes the dog and where he goes to retreat. So there's these three spaces, if you like, in the film. All the journeys in the films are undertaken by the protagonists, and the protagonists in all cases are male. There's none of the countercultural alienation of the late 1960s road movie, and this is, although that's the case, it is true that the sort of male survey of a patronymic territory, which is very much typical of the road movie genre as a whole, also applies in the case of Pema Tseden's films. Although I've said that all the protagonists are male, it is important to notice the very important role of the woman with a scarf across her face in The Search. And one of the very interesting features of that film is how often the camera follows her rather than what the men are doing. And so there's this way in which her role in undermining the director's faith in what he's doing seems to be very important. And we could talk about that in more detail later on, perhaps. So the question that gets opened up here is whether there's a kind of critical space opened up between the pristine landscape and the degraded or damaged culture that we see in the films. The question that I would like to lead to really is, how does the audience conceptualize this Tibetan space that is presented in the films? And I think this is where we have to again, emphasize the idea that different audiences may conceive this in different ways. Pema's films, just to emphasize again, are distributed and shown widely in Tibet, but also in China and then around the world on the film festival circuit. And I think many audiences outside Tibet will, outside the People's Republic of China, simply look at it with a model that is a classic European model where territory plus language plus culture equals nation state. And they read this as a kind of representation of a territorial classic 19th century and post-19th century nation state. But I wonder if for Chinese audiences the film necessarily reads this way. I think that there are some different Chinese ways of thinking about belonging that enable other kinds of understandings. So, for example, the tradition of thinking about the homeland as the guxiang, where you come from, this kind of guxiang thinking does not contain that idea of nation state, of political entity, but it's a cultural space of belonging. And it's quite unproblematic to present that and to perceive things in that way. Furthermore, given that the People's Republic of China's self-conscious narrative distinguishes between the idea of state and a national culture and people, and sees China as a state with 56 national cultures and people, again, the presentation of this Tibetan homeland in the films does not necessarily read in that context, that People's Republic of China context, as a nation state or a proto-nation state. So I think this is one of the reasons why these films read in very different ways to audiences, maybe in film festivals in Europe, from the way they read when they're being shown in Beijing. And one of the questions that one of the things I opened my talk with was by saying to you that I don't speak Tibetan, I've not been to Tibet. So one of the questions I don't know the answer to, but I'm interested to learn more about from other people, is how this kind of homeland representation reads to Tibetan audiences when they watch these films. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Berry. We have 5 minutes for questions and comments. The floor is open. Yes. Give me a microphone.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very interesting talk, and I like the comparison between the two directors. I think that's a very interesting perspective. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on the language in the sense that you were talking about ethnic languages, so Korean on the one hand, Tibetan on the other hand. But we know that this is a little bit more complicated, in particular in the case of Tibet, that there are many languages and dialects and so on. So shall we talk about ethnic languages or local languages, and how does it relate to independent cinema in China, in which local language is always privileged over the national language? And so I was wondering if you could elaborate on this wider context.
Right. I mean, I think that's another, in relation to what I was saying at the end of the talk, I think that's another thing that produces very different understandings among different audiences. So I think that to audiences who are not speakers of Tibetan, they are much more likely to simply understand that this is a Tibetan language film. But as you're drawing attention to, in fact, they're in the local Amdo Tibetan version of Tibetan, or I don't know whether I should call it a dialect or a language. This is always a difficult, complex problem, and very politicized problem as well. But if you think about it as Amdo language, then again, this idea of you can see how from a Chinese perspective, this could be understood as yet more signs of that idea of localness, guxiang, rather than necessarily a proto-nation state or something like that. So again, we get this complexity of how to read the films. I'm curious to hear from others today how Tibetan audiences might perceive that. And this morning I was just chatting with Pema about his latest film and about, which is also, I understand, in a very local language. And I asked him whether Tibetan audiences outside that area would understand the film without subtitles. And he told me that no, they would not. And that in fact, one of his plans is, if I understood correctly, to have it dubbed into other Tibetan dialects to help it get to a larger Tibetan audience. So I think this draws our attention to this problem of how problematic it is to see things through certain kinds of frameworks. Yeah, if that helps. Yeah.
If no, then thank you, Professor. Our next speaker is Mr. Ying Liang. Yes. Mr. Ying is an independent film director, teacher, and curator. He has made many films, including Taking Father Home, Condolences, and When Night Falls. And he is now part-time lecturer at the School of Film and Television at the Hong Kong Academy of Performing Arts. The title of his talk is That is Known and That Is Yet to Be Discovered, Pema Tseden's Fictions and Films. Yes, please, Mr. Ying.
首先非常感谢浸会大学还有亚洲电影节做这个活动，能创作本体了。那当然可以，也许时间如果够，我不知道够不够哈。如果时间够，我会尝试当然不限于创作，可以相对灵活一点，多说一点别的。那么，其实这本今天的小画册的第7页是我的部分了，这个部分其实已经有我今天要说的一个大纲了。那么我讲课或者说演讲的习惯比较坏哈，就不像那个刚才 Chris Berry 教授有一个比较完整的 PPT 哈，然后我都是比较零碎的一些图片式的这样的一个方式哈。那差不多是这样的一个内容，我不知道能讲完多少，我尝试讲一下吧。那么我刚才已经介绍了，说我更多的会从创作本体出发了。那么一个是文学本体了，那么小说啊，另外一个是电影本体了。那么万马我对他了解的不知道到底多不多哈，因为认识算比较多年了。那么差不多他在涉及电影的学习和开始创作的时候，也就是我开始学电影和拍电影的时候，那么是2000年左右，以及21世纪初啊，那么这样的一个状态哈。那这个语境是有一定的共通性哈，那也包括就是在一个中国独立电影的一个环境，或者说一个比较带有独立色彩和艺术色彩的电影的创作和放映的这样一个环境中，那么他作为一个电影导演，对我来讲呢， 是大概可以根据已知的我对他的了解和一些推导哈，大概能够发现一些他从哪里来哈，那么已知的就是他从哪里来啊，那么未知的是他会去哪里啊，那么是这样一个主题啊，今天的我要讲的主题。那么第一个部分我先谈一下我对于他的小说，因为这样一个活动我才很认真地看了他的小说，当然也不是全部啊，更多的是他的中文小说、汉语小说。那么我没有看全面，因为他有别的藏文的语言那个语言的小说我没有看到的。那么在此之前我看过其中的1、2篇呢，那么完整的是第一次，那么还需要时间消化啊。可是因为基于我对他过去电影的大概的了解，所以呢我也可以谈到一些就是他的小说跟电影的互相的一种交叉也好，互相的一种解释也好哈。那么同样的作为一个叙事艺术哈，电影跟小说，那么特别是万马是采取的一个相对来说比较传统的讲故事的这样的一个作者的这样的一种工作方式哈。那么我们其实可以找到一些非常非常具体的一些创作的一些路径和规律来讨论他或者他的作品啊。那么从叙述动力，所谓的叙述动力就是一个 situation， 人物在一个处境当中，他有一个什么样的愿望，那么这样的一种处境与他的愿望之间的冲突，导致于这一次叙述，这一次表述有一个往前进的一个力量啊。那么这个力量是由人物所做出的一系列的行动。那么当面对一些转折的时候，当面对一些抉择决定的时候，他所下的一个决心决定，那么导致于这个故事或者说这一次叙述完成它的结构哈。那这是一般的传统讲故事的一些要件也好啊，或者说规律也好啊。那么万马的小说我刚才说了没有看太全哈，那么就几个比较重点的篇章哈，和电影的几个重点的篇章来比较的话，其实都有一些共同性啊。就像刚才 Chris Berry 教授说到的公路那个寻找哈，那么其实这种不停的去遇见，不停的往前去要实现一个目标，去得到一个东西，或者说要走到一个地方，那么是他的叙述当中非常重要的一个动力了。那么这是个人物的愿望出发的那么玛尼什静静的敲，第9个男人，流浪歌手梦，我不能写全太多哈，只能说写下几个这样的篇章的名字哈。那么玛尼什静静的敲的人物的愿望是能够实现他去世的妈妈的那个愿望，那么就是把那个6字真言刻完哈。那么他的妈妈的愿望是实现爸爸那个去世的爸爸的那个愿望，或者说完成那个心愿哈。那么从而他的妈妈和爸爸都能够安心的往生哈。这个往生也包括那个刻石头的老人的往生。那么这是一种连环的那种因果套在一起的一个愿望，然后组成了这个行为的动力啊。这个行为的动力就是那个主人公是吧？那个主人公要不停的去通过去用梦去遇见那个人，遇见那个老人，然后完成这个6字真言的这个在玛尼什上面的工作。那么第九个男人也是寻找和奇遇哈，就是一个女性不停的在这个情感和男人的那个旅途当中哈，那么不停的有决定哈，离开被抛弃或者又寻找到等等哈。那么流浪歌手的梦是从他童年一个歌手的童年，一直到他成长，到在他梦境中有一个女性哈，到现实中那个女性的生命截止哈。那么他的创作，他的歌声都跟这个有关哈。那么电影我也不是说写出全部的片名，只写出几个哈。那草原是寻找那个偷了牦牛的人是吧？那么寻找之美更登是寻找演员和 寻找那个分手的那个男人，就是从那个蒙面的女孩的角度哈。老狗呢是不停的失去狗和得到狗哈这样一个寻找。这个过程当中就有很多奇遇哈，遇到不停的人，在一个新的处境下推动下一个处境，然后再去寻找，再有奇遇哈。那么我只是以例子的方式来归纳，大概归纳一下啊，我不知道能不能概括到全部万马的作品啊。那我只能说，可能是一个比较典型的状况啊。那么在梦境与现实中穿行，其实这在小说里面特别典型哈。那么我后面会谈到小说跟电影的差异。那么在电影里面，梦境这个东西不太多，或者说穿越梦境这样一个方式并不多，或者是从梦来到现实这样一个行为和叙事的一个很特别的一种民族身份，我会认为，或者说是一种信仰身份不太多。那么小说是非常典型的，就刚才我说的那几篇里面主人公的名字哈，那么玛尼什静静敲的名字哈，人物的名字我写在了这里。那么这种穿行哈，这种梦和现实非真非假哈，这恰恰是讲故事的魅力所在哈，也是创作的魅力所在哈。那么它是进入一个可能的王国哈，进入一个自由的王国哈。那么万马的小说给我的，因为我读得很时间很短哈，特别是完整的读哈，所以我更多的是在努力归纳和谈一些印象哈。那么寻找之美更登，我写下来这个穿越的人，或者说行走的人、寻找的人是摄制组啊，摄制组里有不同的人和蒙面的女孩啊，还有过去的记忆回到这个现实被讲述哈。那么记忆这个部分跟梦境有差别啊，虽然是精神主观的东西哈，可是呢，就是这种性质上的不同，我在后面的差异方面会做一些简单的介绍哈。因为 Jessica 在跟我讨论来做这个演讲的时候说，最终会再交一个完整的一个文本哈，一个文章。那么所以我现在只能够介绍我未来文章或者说正在写的那个文章的一个大纲哈，大概是这样一个情况。那么我摘了一段《流浪歌手的梦》的第一句话哈，为了寻找那个梦想，流浪歌手次人正行进在路上哈。那么很明确是谁，是干嘛，正在为了实现一个什么啊？那么后面就展开他一生的一生的梦哈，或者说一生的追求哈，这是非常典型的说明了或者说印证了我刚才谈到的一些创作的要件。那么我会认为万马的作品虽然是一个相对传统的叙事的情况啊，但是呢，它有很强的一种民族也好啊，或者说信仰也好的一个独立的一个特性哈。这个独立性的意思哈，我并不是从比如说电影的商业经营角度哈，发行角度啊，也不完全是从政治的角度，或者说跟政治的那个审查啊也好，或者说意识形态也好哈，并不是完全等同的。那么我更多的是从不可替换这个角度来讨论的。那不可替换的意思是，比如说这是一个流浪歌手去寻找梦境当中的女孩的故事。那么他通过这个寻找和不断的跟他在梦境中交往，有一些创作。那么包括那个克玛尼什的那个故事哈，那个六字真言跟往生的关系，那这些内容是不是可以替换呢？就是说是不是可以换成别的一个内容呢？或者说一个别的民族，或者说一个别的宗教的呢？那可能比较难啊，这是我提出的一个观点。那么是不是经过严密的论证呢？我还没有。但可是呢，我想先提出来哈。那人物也是一样咯，比如说《寻找之美更登》的这个剧组哈，那么他要做这样一个电影，要找一个这样的跟王子那样的人差不多的演员，那么这样的一个行为，这一组人哈， 到底是不是可以换成别的人，比如说是拍别的电影的，或者说汉族的，或者说美国的电影的。我不是说一定不可，可是呢，从它的叙述的肯定性哈，从电影和小说的这种肯定性哈，和这种非常非常自觉哈，以及非常非常坚信的这样的一种叙述的章法也好啊，或者说完成的故事的魅力美感也好来看，是比较带有不可替换性的。我就写了这个例子是写的是草原哈，因为草原我是他万马做出这个片子几年以后哈，我跟他偶然在讨论电影的时候，然后就问到草原的时候，他跟我介绍和解释的，让我是很震动的，就是看的时候很震动，听到他解释以后我就更明白了。那么草原呢，讲的是这样一个叫阿妈错母的人，然后他的牦牛是被人偷了，那么被人偷了以后呢，这是放生牦牛了，被人偷了以后呢，过了2个季节他都一直没有说，那直到瞒不下去才去找。那么这是小说的内容哈，那么电影其实也是这样一个内容。那么就是很有趣的，就是在于这个叫阿妈错母的人最担心的是偷了牦牛的那两个小伙子是吧？那2个小伙子因为这个罪过而不安，因为这个偷了别人的东西而自责哈，那么所以他才瞒，所以他才不愿意去找，是在别人的鼓动下，村长的鼓动下，一个行政上在进行当代的人那个汉族也好，或者说是一个文明社会也好，我们可能这么来说，来要求啊，从法治或者说是秩序的角度来维护原有的这个纪律，所以才被迫去找那2个犯了错的人，年轻人。那么这个是很有不可替换性的在里面的，就是不去找的原因和去找的无奈哈，以及去找的这个过程，以及对别人的这个担心。那么这些决定和抉择和这些意识，那么这个东西是只有在草原这个小说跟电影里面看到，那么可能在其他的民族或者其他的一种信仰的语境里面并不多。那是不是我可以经过严密的论证呢？我还没有。那么我只能说啊，这样一个事情或者这样一个创作的一个题材和创作的意识是非常非常典型的哈。那么他的小说跟电影的我现在要说的是他小说跟电影的一些异同的地方哈。我可能说的并不太全面，然后也不一定非常非常系统化啊。可是我尝试多说一点。同样的地方是绝望了，或者说同样的地方是不太能达成目的，对吧？那么这个是有趣的，或者说是一个可以比较鲜明的看到。可是小说和电影当中对人对世界的这种绝望，或者说不太能够实现愿望的这样一种结果，或者甚至于每一个环节的过程程度还是不同的。那小说是经常非常绝望的，比如说他看到那个流浪歌手看到那个梦中的那个已经成长为一个非常艳丽的成熟的那样一个身体的女性啊，然后被人发现在河流里死亡。那么这样的一种不能实现，或者说这样一种彻底的结束啊，那么在小说里面是比较多的，但是不能说它是一个，因为这个2个字绝望哈，好像是一个非常负面、非常被动或者说非常消极的啊。可能我觉得不是这2个字，只是我是传递一个愿望实现不了这样一个，或者说不能在这个世界哈，在就是当前这一世哈不能实现。我更多的是这个意思啊，所以这2个字未必写得很对， 或者说我如果在一个完整的叙述当中、表述当中、论证当中，绝望这2个字，我会用一个比较明确的解释来重新像我刚才一样重新解释一下。但是程度不同是肯定的，就是在电影里面的程度和在小说里的程度。那么这个程度不同，就像我刚才说，那个小说的结局是那样，流浪歌手的梦的结局。可是呢，在电影里面呢，比如说《寻找之美跟灯》，只是2个年轻人没有和好，然后那个演员到底找不找到呢？他对电影的拍摄是不是还有信心呢？或者说老狗老狗是一个特别的案例，可以看到一种所谓的绝望，甚至于没有来生，可能是这样的。那么像老狗这样的一个案例，在之后的五彩神剑在之前的玛尼石和至美更灯里是没有的。那么这个没有是很明显的看出小说跟电影的差别。那么小说我会看到有更多可能的世界，就是梦境也好，来世也好，或者前世也好，可能的前世也好。可是电影里没有，或者说电影里面很少，或者说电影里面只用一种委婉的方式曲笔的方式在提及或者说并不重点。那么电影偏向我打引号现实主义那这个现实主义可能是一种就是中国电影或者中国独立电影的某一种创作，或者说某一种中国在艺术教育当中定义的现实主义那么这个现实主义是有一个特别的内涵在里面的。那么其实这种现实主义某种程度上代表着一定的选择。那这个选择呢，比如说跟他小说比，他的可能的世界没有那么现实的多那么电影是某一种现实的选择和对某一种现实的选择和表达会多一点。那么当然刚才Chris Berry 也说到，或者跟其他的那个观众在问答的时候也说到国家这样一个概念、民族概念、文化概念，或者说一个语境、一个体系当中的一个讨论的一个局限，或者说一个界定的概念那么这些概念的讨论就像我们现在所处的这个浸会的 building 外面的那些标语所讨论的东西呢，在万马电影里面是选择性的没有谈的，是没有多谈的。那么其实呢我还没有完全写完的这个大纲或者打出来的这个PPT 里面呢，应该还包括了就是电影跟小说对于最眼前的一些细节的文化和物质生活的一些反应也是有不同的。那小说相对，因为我看的不太多，都是汉字的那几个篇章就是汉文那几个篇章不多可是电影呢，我不知道是不是因为一个中国独立电影的一个创作语境也好，或者说因为作者的很明确在使用电影的时候，发现它的电影的这种语言的具体性、媒介的具体性，发现电影这个媒介的那种高效率性对于眼前事实的反应比如说广告也好，比如说新闻也好，比如说教科书也好，那样的东西呢是非常快速、高效、很简洁的，在电影里只通过1-2个镜头，一场戏里面的某一些细节就能反映出来。可是，在小说可能并不能做到那么高效，而慢慢的小说呈现出来的是一种简洁，是一种非常非常干净和一种循环的状态。那么可能反而从媒介的特征上来说各有所长吧，或者说各司所能吧，可能是这样吧那么电影审查，因为刚才也提到了一点电影审查，那这是很有趣的。比如说在广播电影出版系统，就是在中国现在是广播电影，以前是电影局是吧？现在是这样一个，他把出版、广播电视、电影都放在一起来审查。之上，万马的电影是被宗教局统战部审查的。那么这个是一个特例当中的特例喽。因为比如说大家看这个，我没拿上来，大家看那个亚洲电影节的那个画册，最后会写那个影展的审查统筹是什么，也是 sensitive。可是在一个正常社会当中的电影审查 sensitive 主要是分一个级别嘛，就是不同年龄的人 被指导，或者说被拒绝看某一些电影，过于暴力、过于情色，对吧？可是呢，在中国的特例是在于，它的审查它是以一个政治，是一个当前的政治情况来进行，或者说他所认为的那个党的文化是不是允许的范围来审，这已经是很特别了。可是万马的电影就更特别了，因为它的这个民族的内容和信仰的内容，那么导致于是统战部、宗教局统战部。那么就是说，在中国的这个各部门的官僚机构分而治之，分自己的那个部分治之的时候，在上面有个更大的、更重要的一个审查。那么这个审查是一个很没有道理的，然后跟艺术创作、跟文化其实没有任何关系的，是这样的一种状况。那么审查的方式是从剧本，我不清楚，因为我不是一个西藏的原住民导演，所以我不清楚西藏原住民导演拍的原住民题材的片子的审查流程是什么样的。那么从一个汉人导演的角度，我知道要审查是先看剧本或者剧本大纲，然后给你立项，有一个拍摄许可证，再到拍摄完成以后他会来看，来看的人呢是一个所谓的审查的小组。那这个小组呢是有各种成分的，比如说所谓研究电影的教授啊，研究电影政策的教授啊，也包括一些曾经的创作者。那么官员啊，广电部的官员组成一个，我想万马那个可能还有宗教局统战部的官员啊，甚至于那个公安系统啊，我觉得这也是非常正常。我不清楚这个，我想是参与者会最清楚。那么万马提交的剧本和完成片应该都是汉语的书面的那个汉语，包括最后审查的时候是用字幕，是用汉文的字幕，或者说给他对照的一个对白本才能够审查。那这种方式是非常非常特别，或者说在特殊的中国电影文化语境、政策语境和生产流程当中更特别的一个状况。那么所以呢万马的片子出得很慢，呢，出得不太快啊，出得不太快，就是因为审查这个原因，那么实际上07年就已经完成了《寻找之美更登》，可是我第一次看到拿出来对公众放映的时候是09年在上海的上海国际电影节，是2年以后，因为他要等待。而08年的时候，因为奥运，中国的审查都大量停止。就不工作了，我宁愿不做事，就没有错，对吧？那么老狗是2010年就完成了，对吧？2010年拿出来放，这个10应该是放的时候，大概放的时候，或者09年、10年放的时候。可是呢，我2009年在看《致美更》的时候，我已经见过老狗的完成片的 DVD 了。那也就是说，作为一个正常，如果万马是在一个正常的社会当中的一个导演的话，他的出片的效率和出片的一个速度，应该是一个正常导演的速度，可是不是，恰恰不是啊。那这个是我之所以提审查，是在指向说前面讨论的电影跟小说的差异的可能的原因，我在提这个原因啊。好，那么还有多少？5分钟啊，那我很快讲下去吧，因为那个只能够用浏览式的来讲了。因为我本来还想谈那个媒介的兼容性的不同，那我就很快就说到万马可能从哪里来哈，就很快的啊，5分钟好。他所在的北京电影学院，他所在的科系是非常特别，叫文学系啊。那么这个文学系是培养导演的文学系，因为北京电影学院的导演系不知道为什么近十几年培养不出具有创作贡献的导演哈那么在他的同期的文学系的同辈的同学们中间，除了万马第一部片子在05年出现以外，刘嘉英的牛皮在05年也出现了，他是文学系的学生，他们都有共同的老师哈。彭涛是在2年以后第一部长片叫《雪蝉》。一个叫温守明的，他是原来在导演系，然后在导演系读得非常难受，转到文学系，拍出了他当时07年的第一部长片。很奇怪，就出了很多拍出长片的导演，可是他们来自文学系。这个原因是 很复杂的，跟电影学院的教学构成、老师构成和当时的中国电影特别是独立电影的公开的放映和大量的生产大量的创作是有关的。那么我要很快的讲，那么学生作品时期的比较代表性的2部短片一个是用 DV， 我也不确认我到现在都没有问过它是什么型号，是3CCD 还是单 CCD， 甚至于是 Super A， 可能是那样的一个格式。那这个产生的年代在02年，也是一个非常典型的 DV 兴盛，然后刚刚开始进行公众放映和交流的时候。那草原呢，就是代表了万马的这个学习的出生，是一个电影学院的一个联合的毕业作业，是分成工业的这样的一种工作方式去完成的，而且是用胶片拍摄那么这个跟他后来的第1部长片的创作直接有关。那部创作是来自于电影学院的青年电影制片厂，是拿到审查的标志，然后是有一个团队来生产，那么也是由他们学校的老师在协助帮忙做监制的，大概是这样一个状况。这是万马从哪里来那么我很快的列出来，大家看一下吧就可以了。那么万马跟其他电影部分的一些关系在那个2年前吧，在 Some and Sci and Sound 那个杂志在请大家来评选，就有导演、有评论家有那个理论家都有来评选历史上你认为10部你认为可以排到 Top 10的片子的时候，万马选了这10部。那我们可以看看这10部跟他现在的创作的关系，也许跟未来创作有关，我不清楚。比如说特别的是第9个他排的《穆赫兰道》我是很震惊，这个跟万马有什么关系？我是很震惊的那么我不知道是不是有关比如游戏规则，我可以从场面调度，从导演的控制角度，我会包括公民坎我都可以找到。而随风而逝流浪艺人就是雾中风景，我都能找到那种感觉，那文化精神的感觉我都能找到可是野草莓有一点点奇怪，穆赫兰道就非常特别那么这是万马对于他选的10部片子所做出的解释的理由。那么这些理由我们可以看从导演，当然导演说的并不一定我们都认同是作为能解释他的内容或者说理据，可是我们可以从他一个完整的一个从创作到讨论的一个精神画像或者精神生命体的一个情况来进行一个了解吧，最起码对不对？那么很有趣我们可以看到他的创作的脉络或者一些细节跟他所写的话的某些关联那另一位藏族今天没有时间多说了，也叫贾扬宗萨仁波切他是一个活佛那么他是另一位西藏族的导演 Tibetan 的导演，他是在不丹生活的。那么他们的差别我会觉得比较大的差别在于贾扬宗萨仁波切特别是在前2部这高山世界杯里面，其实很多的讲到流亡的主题。那么在旅行者、魔法师，在最近一部 Blessing 这几部片子里面都讲到了爱情讲到了那个冲破伦理道德的爱情，讲到了这些东西那这些部分是不太一样。那么我不能比较在这里说太多，跟塞德克巴莱的比较，塞德克巴莱讲到的是一个更激烈的文明冲突，用的方式是一个战争的，用的是这样的一种特别好看的电影的方式和战争的内容和行为好，那我很快再用最后1分钟把后面要说的，因为本来我有一些片段要放，可是呢时间不够然后我也不确认这个声音怎么样，因为既然讨论电影应该放电影本身的片段就像讨论文学应该出现文字那样，可是今天没有时间了，那么我只能大概说一下，我本来要讲的第3部分是分成这几个内容的。那么静静玛尼什有一部短片，那部短片就我刚才说它可能是用 Super A 或者说用 Mini DV 拍的，那部短片的意义我会觉得更多的在于叙事本身的意义，一个小喇嘛过新年要看唐僧喇嘛西游记的故事，那么这个我会看到一个特别的不可替换的人物和他人物的行为和 situation。 那么长版的时空处理我个人认为万马在那个第1部长片那样一个篇目和篇幅和规模当中， 他对时空的处理在当时还不太完善，还不太构成一种比较体系化或者清醒、特别自觉的一个状态。可是我现在没有时间放那些例子。那我会看到他在修赛景别的使用，和在对于时间流逝的省略和时间之间的连贯性上面，在当时的长版的《玛尼》是这部长篇的篇幅提出难题，对个导演第一部做长篇的导演提出这么难题的情况下，他当时还在尝试和进展当中。那么《寻找之美更灯》，我原来想放它的开头，就是他对于语言的自觉和对那个空间的自觉和对空间里面的时间的自觉，那这个东西呢是非常非常清晰的，非常非常清晰的。那么这个时候只是隔了几年，在第二部长篇作品里面已经展现出一种惊人的成熟。那争议点更多的是有人说会不会，比如说像阿巴兹的片啊，或者说像欧洲某一个导演的片，那我个人觉得不是太重要，不是太重要，更多是跟它内容有关。那到老狗的时候呢，是一个非常自由的，可能非常自由的一个创作，因为我也原来会放一些片段哈，比如说里面的主人公在县城的街道那边坐在摩托车上，这时候就看到了边上小朋友在那边跟小动物玩呢，或者小动物在那边跑，猪啊、羊啊，然后有一个被风吹动的纸在那边飞啊，灯笼还是什么哈，那这些东西是非常即兴的状态。那这种状态在过去的知美更灯和玛尼史里面是没有看到过的，是没有的。那这种即兴我看到的是一种自信啊，是一种非常从容的状态。也就是说，实际上他是万马到那个时候已经是非常成熟的一个导演，只是说因为他的处境，就我刚才说的政治审查、民族信仰的处境，导致于他其实原来可以更成熟，可是很可惜，或者会被更多人认识，可是有可惜的地方。那传播时遇到的现实就是这样。老狗的那个结局是万马非常本人在放映上也是非常决绝的一个结局，就是说我不改，就是我如果要改的话，那我就不放，就是不通过你的审查就算了。那么所以呢，老狗的那个版本呢是没有在电影院，不像前面的那个拿到了一个审查的标志的那样的一种方式进行传播的，那更多的是在一个独立电影的环境、电影节上进行放映。那么当年在我们重庆，我办的重庆的电影节放映的时候，有非常多的讨论和争议，非常热烈。我还没有跟万马面对面交流过这个事，是非常有趣的。那以后可以有机会，包括写这个文章的时候，可能有机会会再说一下哈。那么这个我就大概，因为本来这个地方应该是放片段的。那么尾声是未知是什么，我不是太清楚未来会怎么样。那当然我期待未来。
Right, we can have 5 minutes for discussion, questions. Any questions? Yes? Microphone?
好，谢谢你。我用中文问可以吗？好，那你在说那个他的小说跟电影之间有一些话语啊、语言啊，他要处理的东西。那我想问一下，其实这个问题最好是问他本人的啦。但是你再解说一下，你会不会看到有一些对于宗教，就是西藏佛教的一些材料在里面吗？因为你也谈到已知跟未知，然后因果你也谈到，或者是人的欲望跟绝望，让我想起可能也有渗入一些关于西藏佛教的一些材料在里面，有没有这方面的一些解读吗？
我会认为哈，就当然是我的角度，导演作者在这里。那么我会觉得小说的传递的信息非常清晰，非常完整。这个往生也好啊，然后里面的那些人物的心情和精神的寄托和他的那种决定的做出，都是这个民族和那个信仰体系语境当中的人 所特别或者不可替换的这样的一种结果和发展延续。那么电影的话呢，有很多就我刚才说的一些具体的问题。那么导演他以导演的身份在讲述这些内容的时候，比较委婉了，然后遇到了外界的很具体的一些强性的一些限制。那这个东西是很清晰的，比如说《寻找之美更登》，电影《寻找之美更登》啊，他们去到歌舞团去问有谁是可以来演的，然后有谁会唱藏语的歌和说藏语的。那么当这个电影在放映的时候，这一段要重新配音咯，就说在那个电影里面原来的对白里面会说到，我们都不太会用藏语唱歌和用藏语来表达了。那这个内容呢，在公映的电影里面是被改写的，就要重新配，就是这一段不能这么说，可能要回避掉西藏的事情。那么我想在其他的一些电影里面，在导演在创作过程中可能就已经自觉的在回避，然后在那个未来的后续的从拍到审查的过程当中又被动的再回避。那么这样的一种状况，包括就是故事本身的那个处境，人物的处境，那么也不会那么像小说比较清晰和无拘束吧，就是那种可能的世界里面可能的人那种自由的状况。小说我会更觉得跟贾扬清哲仁波切里那个魔术师旅行者有点相近的部分呢，或者说跟那个高山山世界杯啊、小活佛世界杯、看世界杯有相近的部分啊，那种精神流亡，就是那种寻找精神家乡，就这种东西会特别清晰。可是电影没有那么样的鲜明，这个是一个需要再有更多讨论跟论证才能够明白的。那么我觉得，我不知道在座是不是都看所有的万马的，最起码汉文的小说和电影啊？我不知道我的观点是不是有人不认同啊？不认同我们可以讨论，包括万马自己在这里。
好。Any other question in English or Chinese? Yes? Microphone, please.
还在提。那么我想知道是在表现藏文化方面，万马导演的影片和这位不丹的藏族导演的影片，他们的联系和差异是怎么样表现的？
那个导演在中国也是被遮蔽的，然后其实他跟中国有没有曾经发生过关系啊？好像也没有。然后最多是贝尔图鲁奇那个意大利导演，在拍小活佛还是拍什么的时候，他应该是小活佛的时候，那个不丹的那位活佛导演曾经做过他的助理，那么就热爱上就是要继续从事电影工作。那么我会比较明确的，刚才我也谈到了，就是我比较明确的看到，那位导演比较强的一种，更在电影当中，就是更能跨越和穿越的一些能力。这个可能，比如说他的最近的一部片子，不是拍西藏民族的，不是拍藏族的，拍的是印度的，那么讲的是爱情，然后是不伦的爱情。那么这个东西是，没有包袱的情况下，作为一个创作者感兴趣，所以就开始谈了的。然后对于自己的突破，在题材本身，在伦理本身，他是很大胆，或者说他是有一种决心去做的。那么在之前的看世界杯，高山世界杯那样片子里面，我会看到那种幽默，然后看到了那种那种流亡，包括是精神流亡的那种痛苦和喜悦。那这种东西呢，在万马的小说里是能看到的，可是在万马的电影里面呢没有，包括幽默感也不多。 那么小说很幽默的，然后很有那种不受拘束的那种气息。那这个不受拘束也包括自我的放逐跟寻找当中的那种流亡的那样的一种精神状况。那么这个我会觉得是比较大的差别。
Have one more question? Any? If not, then please, thank you, Mr. Ying. Our third speaker this session is Dr. Lo Wai-luk. Dr. Lo is a colleague. He's an associate professor at the Film Academy, and he's the respondent to the 2 talks this morning. Please.
It is a very difficult task for me to respond to this two papers or sharings or research or findings because the papers, the research is works in progress, and so I did not have chance reading the draft. So I heard the presentation at the same time together with you. So I try to respond to their research and their discoveries and their finding simply by my personal immediate sensibility or rationality. So this is something that perhaps should be regarded as a kind of sharing more than a formal response. The first paper, I think the first paper shows very well Professor Chris Berry's academic background and tradition. Primarily, I see Professor Berry utilized the methodologies grounded on comparative literature. The methodology is primarily on that ground. And the basic perspective in terms of structure is a kind of structuralism, to see the 2 directors as a kind of binary opposition, and by putting them together to see what counterpose them. So this way of thinking is very helpful for us to understand the commonality of the 2 directors Professor Berry is comparing, and to see into the uniqueness and the distinct particularities of the director that we are in focus today, Pema Tseden. And I think from the presentation, I think that I can see the love of Chinese cinema and Chinese independent cinema of Professor Berry. There is no doubt that his perspective is embedded with an very conspicuous passion and empathy towards those people that who want to find meaning in life and in their own culture. This is very distinctive, and this is also something that at present in the present human condition. Someone said that China actually is no longer socialism. So what is China? But China says in their constitution that China is a socialist country, and China still regarded communism as their ideal. And so the Chinese Communist Party is the only ruling party that guide the whole nation towards communism. But in reality, this is not the case. And in terms of market economy, in terms of the popular culture environment, and in terms of many other aspects. So this kind of disconnectedness actually motivate many conscientious filmmakers take up independent productions as a way to reflect upon what actually is the situation of living in China or being in China. Whichever part. So to me, Pema Tseden's film, although they are primarily confined to the geographical area of Tibet, but it is not just a Tibetan cultural discourse. They are not just Tibetan cultural discourses. Actually, we can regard those films as a kind of reflection. And I can see the reflection is actually quite significant for all Chinese people in all parts of China, within China and without China, including ourselves living in Hong Kong, to think through the future wood of these people, including ourselves. So this is something that I see the further development of Professor Barry's paper, because he presented a very clear comparison and a kind of structure has developed. The next step is to interpret the findings and utilize the interpretation to develop a kind of dialogue with the directors, with these two directors, and with other conscientious independent filmmakers, or those filmmakers work within the system but want to work out something beyond the control of the system. So this is my response to the first paper, and my hope and my appreciation and regard to Professor Barry's paper. And of course, I also want to suggest maybe Tian Zhuang's ethnic film, The Horse Thief, may also be compared with Pema Tseden's discourse somewhere in your future writings. Yeah, because after the Cultural Revolution, the fifth generation actually have developed a kind of reflection on the fringe of China. So they try to think out a way that they can continue their life and start their production. So they were producing their films immediately after the Cultural Revolution, but 20 years later, Pema produced the film and following the similar routes. But we know that Tan Zhuangzhang, when Tan Zhuangzhang decided to produce a film on the people's history, the common people's life after the 1949 revolution, he was banned. I mean the booklight. The booklight cannot be shown in China, and Tan Zhuangzhang was banned, cannot produce films for 10 years in China. But Tan Zhuangzhang make a very, very bold and very courageous decision. He stayed in China. He endured the 10 years. So what is the meaning of this endurance for a director in the age of 30-something, 40? Because a person, a man at his 40 is a mature man. But he decided not to leave China, but stayed inside China. So this is very, very significant. And so maybe in the discussion of Pema Tseden's cultural discourse or filmic discourse, Tan Zhuangzhang is also a person to be compared. Okay, so thank you, Professor Barry. 那现在我就谈第二篇文章应亮的那个讨论。那我觉得呢，应亮呢非常明显呢，他的学识的背景呢是一个电影学的艺术学的那个背景，所以呢那个文章里头就是基本上就是按照一个艺术学的那个就是讨论事情的方法比如说那个艺术家的那个成长的背景啦不同艺术门类的那个分别，比如说小说呢、电影的之间的分别啦。然后呢，因为是一个电影的导演嘛，所以就从电影的语言的角度去看那个电影的叙述啦，跟影像方面的关联。所以整个文章的那个取向的那个是这样子。那所以呢，里头呈现的一种文本的那种就是分析呢，也是比较就是属于那个传统的。那我觉得呢，也是非常有启发性的。那个启发性呢，是在于因为应亮导演他本身也是在那个语境下边进行一些创作的，所以呢，他对那个Pema Tseden的那个影片里头呈现出来的一些探索呢，它是有自己的就是一种我们用文字说呢，就是生命的关联。所以仿佛他所做的事情，也是你在另外一个角落做的一些实验的一些事情。表面的内容也许不同，但是呢，上面的某一种事情呢是一致的。那所以呢，在听那个presentation 的整个过程之后呢，我就发现呢，也许呢有一个状态呢是这样子的，就是说呢，那个 Pema Tseden 的那个电影的，基本上你看到的就是应亮导演看到的，就是尽量的处理的情况呢，就是一个人离开了中心，不信服那个权威，并且呢，整个族群呢，因为那个时代改变了，生活的方式不同了，或者是已经有那个市场的经济了，也没有以前的那个意识形态的那种就是奔头了。那个人在那种状态下边，他怎么样去能够生存下去？怎么样去生活下去？那生存下去呢，还是比较可以比较容易解决的，但是生活下去就是活出来有一个就是价值的那个部分，那个价值在什么地方那个部分呢？就是我觉得呢，就是可以看到呢，就是你去看那个 Pema Tseden 那个电影的一个状态，所以你提到呢那个Pema 呢，他是绝望的，他那个绝望呢，当然不是对整个生命绝望，而是对整个个体要追求生命自由的那些人，但是在那种状态下面，他无能为力的那个绝望，而不是如果真是绝望呢，就是自杀就可以解决问题了。但是呢，自杀也不能够解决那个问题，因为呢，他自杀的那个当下，他就知道那个环境不会因为他的死而有丝毫的改变。那个呢，就是鲁迅先生之前就是在那个呐喊秩序里头说到的，就是他看到那种非常麻木的那种一群人，那从而他觉得要医治的不光是他们的身体，而是他们的灵魂。那现在呢，是仿佛我们看到呢，就是他们的灵魂也很难，就是有丝毫的一些医治，并且呢，仿佛那个屋檐北京的阴霾越来越多，但是呢，在人民的心里头的阴霾，也许呢也越来越浓。那种绝望呢，我觉得是有一种 commonality 的，但是呢，怎么样去处理那个问题本身？以前好多的那个独立的电影，我看到一部分呢，有机会看到的那种呢，都是呢就是在一种自我的流放，或是自我的 indifferent， 就自我的疏离好像那个卡缪的那个小说《异乡人》的那种我当众孤独我在我的朋友，在一帮唱卡拉 OK 的人里头，我当众孤独，来用那种当众孤独的那种状态呢，告诉我还是能够有我的自我但是呢，当众孤独够吗？那个就是我要提出的那个问题，对于我们整代的要追求生命自由的人都要提出的问题，就等如在一个时代，我们中国最多的出现的是那种所谓的忍士。忍士呢，就是我不管国家，不管政治了，我自己做自己的事情算但是呢，我让你知道我的存在我就喝酒，我就做我喜欢做的事情。但是呢，那个是中国的传统。那在今天呢，也许呢，我们要问一个问题呢，就是在今天那个状态，我们 能不能够循了那个方向之外，有别的方向呢？那个就是我觉得我们那一代的追求自由的、独立的生产人、创作人都要共同解决的问题。那 this is 这是我的对应亮的回应，谢谢。
Thank you, Dr. Lo, for these very thought-provoking comments. And now we have about 15 to 20 minutes, and the floor is open, free discussion, questions. We would like to invite Professor Berry and Mr. Ying, and we may have discussions and questions about their talk and also about Dr. Lo's comments. Any questions, comments? Yes?
So I guess that's a question for both speakers, but more specifically maybe to Chris Berry, because I simply haven't read all of Pema Tseden's work, so I'm not too sure about the writing part of it. But my question would be, how do you interpret the fact that there are no Han or other ethnic minority people in Pema Tseden's film, considering that we can see them as road movies, and traveling would involve, encounters with others. So I'm wondering how you would see that in the context of road movies. And then I was wondering if that's the same thing in literature, if Han characters are almost totally absent from Pema Tseden's writing.
Okay, I guess first of all we have to note that, of course, in Old Dog there is the Chinese trader, and of course, for me that's a very significant moment, because that's the moment in the films, that's the one moment where you suddenly see modernity and the city and the space of the market economy marked in some way as Chinese. And elsewhere in all the other films, and including in Old Dog elsewhere, the threat to the Tibetan culture is not marked as particularly Chinese. So in some sense, through that moment in Old Dog, you begin to think about it as a kind of structuring absence. So this raises various kinds of issues. One, I think it reminds us that these films, of course, are not some kind of, they're not documentaries of contemporary Tibet, nor are they realist depictions of contemporary Tibet from what I know of contemporary Tibet, which is not just what I read. As I've said before, I haven't been there. So again, then this opens up this question of how this might be imagined by audiences, and I think it raises various kinds of possibilities, ranging from those audiences who really don't know anything at all about the fact of migration into Tibet of other peoples, and so on, who may just think it is, mistakenly believe it is a realist representation, to people who will see this as a kind of fantasy, a kind of dream of a Tibet that is completely Tibetan culture and Tibetan people and so on, however internally diverse, but nonetheless understood as one culture, to people who will, as I say, see it as a structuring absence, as something which is marked in the films as the things that cannot be spoken about. And maybe this goes back to something that Ying Liang was talking about, which is, you know, the very complex and difficult process of getting through the censorship process for films in China, that there are certain kinds of things that are too difficult to be dealt with and that cannot really go into the films if the films are going to make it through that process. So I don't know if those are some of the things that occur to me. But one thing I do want to add is that I think one of the important things about saying that these films are in the road movie category or the road movie genre or the travel film, if we want to put it in that larger way, is that I think immediately that very genre brings up the question of what is the nature of this space we are in, right? Us and the space is it a territory, the space being both a territory and a culture. And I think that all the ambiguities around that are what animate Pema's works and make them so interesting, that they are very ambiguous and they can be read in many different ways by different people.
Any other questions?
我可以尝试说我想到的内容，就是有一个比较有趣的现象啊，未必我看得很全，就是万马的创作的团队，其实里面的汉人的存在越来越少了，甚至于没有了。
Thanks. Well, I have the questions to both speakers. It's about the comparison. I guess the two papers have already done quite a lot of comparison, but somehow I want you to make further comparison. The first time when I heard Chris' paper a few months ago, I somewhat already raised similar questions. How you would compare the road movie of Pema with other road movies that have been released, not just in the era of market economy. We know that in the period of market economy also mainstream Chinese film industry also produced quite a lot of road movies. But other than that, since you brought up with the space relation, it kind of reminds me, even before the era of market economy, in the Mao's era, quite a lot of socialist revolutionary movie could be broadly understood as road movie in the sense that they go to different places or space in order to somehow extend the nation, to kind of as a part of nation building project, right? We somehow to include all those borderlands into part of this territorial sovereignty of the new nation. So does it make any sense to compare Pema's road movie with the road movie in the Chinese context after 1949 not just the modern one? That's the question for Chris. 另外一个问题问Ying Liang就是你刚才已经比较了他的小说电影，我想就是可不可以再比较一下万瓦的小说跟其他的当代的作家，比如说藏族的作家。因为我知道的很少，或者是其他民族的，不一定是汉族的，有没有像类似的风格的一个小说？你怎么评价它跟其他的当代的一些其他民族的在中国里边的一个文学的发展的？你怎么可以看这个方面？可不可以让我们知道多一点这方面的情况？谢谢。
Okay, so I think this is a really interesting question, and there are a number of aspects of it to raise. I suppose the first complication, the first complexity is how do we understand the road movie? And I've already said today that I think this looking at Pema's films in the context of the road movie is part of a process of redefining the road movie and rethinking it, so that people no longer are saying necessarily the road movie is the quintessentially American genre or something like that. However, so far, even the people who have extended it have tried to also place certain kind of limits. Does it mean, in other words, does it mean any kind of film that involves travel is then a road movie, you know, or a journey film? Or should we have some other kind of definition? And one of the ways in which it has been limited is to suggest that for the journey film, we must think about it as usually driven by an individual person's journey. And through their journey, they are involved in a process of questioning who they are in relation to some space of belonging, a cultural space, other people, a territory, and so on. So I think in relation to those post-1949 films about establishing a sense of the PRC territory, if we want to call it that, one of the questions I would have to think about if I look at those films is to what extent are they personalized in that way, as a sort of personal journey of discovery, or maybe not. And if they're not, then maybe that again creates a question around should we be limiting the travel genre as personal journeys of discovery, or should we be, again, questioning it and opening it up in other ways? So having said that, which is just to ask another lot of questions, really, rather than answer you, I would say that at the moment, it's, for me, something I haven't got a clear perspective on yet. But I'm very interested in, at the moment, in trying to start to investigate more about the idea of the road movie in Chinese culture, which is, I think, something that hasn't been studied a lot yet, and to maybe try and open that up a bit more. So I'm also interested in looking at more commercial Han Chinese contemporary market economy narratives, certainly. I'm not sure if I want to go back into the Mao era yet, but I would like to, if I extend this project more, not just look at Zhang Lu's films and Pema Tseden's films, but also look at, for example, Han Han's new film, which I haven't seen yet, and other films like that. Yeah, but I can't say any more than that at the moment.
这个问题很难回答，就是这个跟其他的中国小说，或者是当代的，或者是民族的之间的比较，因为它需要一个更多的阅读，然后需要一些更系统化的研究，才可以做出某一些观点的提出。那么我只能够从自己的有限的阅读角度来做一些类比，或者说寻找一些不同和共同的某些地方吧。比如说，我个人比较喜欢，这不是当代了，比较以前的30、40年代的上海的新感觉派了。那新感觉派的话，它比较画面啊，然后有很多真和假的部分，然后有很多那种摩登时代的东西在里面，那么私人的那种感觉在里面。那么像这样的有可以做比较的部分，我会很有兴趣。比如说万马的小说是很有电影感的，然后万马的小说读起来是很简单的，似乎很简单，就我是说文字和结构上似乎是很简单的，然后有真与假的这样的一种对比。那么我会又说到电影，就比如说我看到万马在那个导演的介绍里面说，未来一部电影的名字叫《永恒一天》哈，那么这是一个很大的一个名字哈，那么来自于安哲洛布洛斯的那部电影的名字。那么讲的是那部电影讲的是一个民族的文化和历史，讲的这样一个东西，非常宏大。可是万马的小说恰恰没有这种宏大的东西啊，讲的都是很个体的一个人的， 然后这一个人在某一些处境当中行走，然后似真似假，然后一段这样的历程。那么这样的方式和这种细微的这种细节的和这种感觉性的东西，那么我会在他的电影里面比较，就是已经有的这几部电影里面不太能找到对应的部分。那么在已经有的中国当代的小说，或者说我自己阅读面里面的小说来去找一些关联性的时候，我会发现，比如说，可能有点远，我不知道。比如说那时候90年代绵绵的小说，上海的绵绵的小说，那么它是讲摇滚青年呐、讲那种失落的，讲那种堕落，讲那种青春成长。那么这种部分跟万马的是不是有一定的关联？那我会看到也是部分的关联。比如说电影感、画面感很强，比如说它的文句很简单，或者说很直接。那这种东西有相似的部分。那么跟汉族的比较著名的那些作家的作品，就是这几年比较得到瞩目的作品相比较，那么我会觉得还是有比较大的，我会看到一些差异的东西会多一点点。那比如说那些比较著名的作家，就是莫言呐，比如说以前冯骥才啊，就是那些就是那样的带有传奇，带有比较历史，有一些宏观那种部分是我会看到很不一样，非常不同。那么我在之前的那个发言里面也提到了某一种不可替换性，尽管没有严密的论证，可是很多时候像刚才那个卢伟立教授说到，就是虽然是一个民族和本地的电影，可是全世界人能感觉到。可是我会觉得感觉到的原因，就像我个人在看草原，又听到万马在跟我讨论草原的时候的那样，就是这个电影帮我走过了一段困惑，明白了这个族群的价值的观念原来是这个样子的，情感来源是这个样子。那这些部分是不可替代，或者说在看这个电影或者看它的文字的以前是没有这个机会去克服的，就这是属于一个障碍。那么恰恰当他明白了克服的时候，这个时候就进入一个比较自由的交流的对话的状况了。那这种东西是万马小说和电影，特别是小说，我会觉得提供的价值，或者说它所不可替换的，跟当代的其他的文学，汉族的，我不知道那个其他的族群的文学的状况，我不太了解。那我看过一些很旧的，比如说黑骏马的，当然他也是汉人，可是是在那个本地，在蒙古本地写的是那个生活。那么我会觉得也不太一样。
Time is 5 minutes past 12. This session has come to a close. And thank you again to Professor Berry, Mr. Ying, and Dr. Lo. Thank you.